So I'll be talking today specifically about faculty-led short-term study abroad programs. And this is an effort between myself, I'm Lori Czerwionka, I'm an associate professor of Spanish and linguistics at Purdue, and Michael Bittinger, who couldn't be here today, and he's the associate director of the study abroad office at Purdue. And what we're interested in thinking about is specifically this outcome of intercultural competence, intercultural communicative competence, and what sort of opportunities do students have during short-term study abroad to actually practice those interactions, those intercultural communication interactions. So intercultural communicative competence is the ability to communicate effectively and appropriately in intercultural situations. And it relies on sets of knowledge and skills and abilities. Oh, attitudes. Abilities sometimes gets thrown in there too. And lots of other words that you've heard today. There are many strengths in intercultural competence research, and one of those is this nitty-gritty about the knowledge, the skills, the attitudes. Right? So when we have these efforts to develop intercultural competence and work with students or faculty members or people in general, that also is one of the strengths, right? Focusing on bits and pieces of the knowledge, skills, and attitudes that together combine to create intercultural communicators. But what we're interested in is that final outcome. Right? How do you gain practice with communicating with people who are diverse from you or in situations of cultural difference? So considering that that's the primary aim, we're claiming that effective and appropriate communication must be a main focus both practically and theoretically. And so that's what we're interested in looking at a little bit more in depth. So we look at study abroad because we know that numbers of US-based students' participation in study abroad has increased over the last many decades. We also know that in recent years, a large number of students are doing short-term study abroad, so 8 weeks or less in another country. And that's 64% of our students. So we want to focus on that to begin with. And we also know that we have these false assumptions sometimes, right? Or maybe we don't, but a lot of people do about study abroad, such as when surrounded by cultural difference, it's natural to engage in it. Students will voluntarily step outside of their bubbles to explore difference, and that all study abroad program leaders have the expertise and know-how to have their students, to encourage their students to engage in difference. And as you've seen today, part of what Sylmar does for us at Purdue is communicate that these assumptions are most often false and work to overcome them at our institution. So our question is, to what degree and how do study abroad programs direct students to practice intercultural communication? We had 3 research questions. The first is, with what frequency do short-term study abroad programs include curricular tasks and directives for communication with locals? What are the characteristics of exemplar tasks? And what barriers exist to include these sort of tasks in programs? We decided to go with a survey approach. It was a brief survey to try to encourage people to give us some information about their programs. We contacted faculty leaders of short-term study abroad programs who had led programs over the last 2 years at our institution. And so we sent this survey to 117 respondents. We had 39 people respond, so a response rate of 33%. Thank you to some of you who responded. And our questionnaire was quite basic. And we had 2 questions. We first introduced the idea of what we were looking for. What does it mean to have a task that encourages communication and intercultural communication? And then we said, have you included curricular tasks in your study abroad program that encourage this type of interaction? And if so, can you please describe it? And if you have instructions or directives that you give your students, you could upload those as well. If you didn't want to take the time to write it, you just upload what you use. And then the second question was about barriers. What type of barriers do faculty leaders see in implementing this sort of program? Our analysis was 3-step. The first was categorization and quantification of the types of tasks that they told us about. So the first, we basically categorized whether they were heavily structured activities, semi-structured, or not a target activity. Then we looked at these structured activities. We went through and decided what kind of characteristics were ideal, and then we analyzed the barriers. So with the first one, of our 29 respondents, we had 22 people say, yes, we include these types of activities. So that's almost 60% of our respondents. Now, granted, we should be aware of this possible response bias, that of 117 people, only 39 responded. So we could think that maybe the ones who didn't respond, maybe it's because they didn't feel like they had anything to contribute to the conversation, but we don't know that for sure. Right? And so of the 22 responses that said, yes, we do this type of activity, our students are engaging in intercultural communication while they're abroad, 18 were heavily structured, 2 were semi-structured, and 2 didn't really fit what we were looking for. So we're going to focus on the heavily structured ones, and I'll just give you 3 examples. The first one, the summary given by this faculty member says, an activity to compare professional life in France and in the US that requires students to go to an employment office, describe it according to a series of specific questions, and to interview employees about the different ways to find a job in France. They have to write a report afterwards. So we see this intercultural communication happening at the interview level. We see it's highly structured. There are multiple steps. There are interview questions that are, questions they have to consider when they're at this local place. And then it's included in the curriculum. It's included in the program. And we see that with the report afterwards. The second one says, I have my students conduct 3 field assignments. The first is a scavenger hunt. The second has the students in small groups formulating a survey of 12 to 15 locals. And then the third is a one-on-one conversation, right? So here, the strength that we see is multiple activities guiding the learners to get to this one-on-one interaction that is an intercultural exchange. The third one says, working in binational teams with host university students. Students interview local entrepreneurs and NGOs about their beliefs, values, goals, and challenges. Students must share the learning module, so their outcomes at the end, with village leaders and families and document the exchange of ideas in video or photo voice. So this one we see multiple levels of intercultural communication happening. We see working with another person, which we saw in one of the prior presentations, is an ideal way to go about creating these intercultural relationships and practicing intercultural communication. We see interviews with other local community members, and then we see this sharing back the other direction, taking what's been created in intercultural communication and reflecting on how do you communicate that to the local community. The semi-structured examples were rather suggestions. So the faculty leaders seem to hold these principles as ideal, and they even, in the second one, give students a list of questions to ask local staff in Kiswahili, but it's not really part of the program. It's a really nice suggestion that one should do. So these sort of fit, but they're semi-structured. They're not really embedded in the program in the same way. And then we have a few that are not target activity examples. More students participate as observers. They hear from local people maybe, or the assumption that by being in a local school or being in a community, you necessarily have practice with intercultural communication. So our second part was going back to those structured activities and saying, what are the ideal characteristics of these? And there were 4 that emerged in our data, in this small set of data. So multiple tasks or directives during the program, development of long-term relationships, and we see that through some of the binational collaboration that was happening. That happens over the course of the program. We had another example where students email with the local students that they'll be working with 3 months in advance. And so they go through this longer process of getting to know them, communicating before they arrive. Collaborative work with locals, right? And assessment that's included in the curriculum. And this is a question we didn't ask specifically about. Many people indicated that it's part of their curriculum, it's part of their learning outcomes, and that could be thanks to Sylmar. But we don't know. So that's something that is one of the 4 key characteristics that seems to be useful in letting students practice intercultural communication while they're abroad. When we asked about the barriers, there were 2 types of barriers that emerged. One for learners, and the main one was language. And then the second one were barriers for the program leaders. And for program leaders, the main one was lack of awareness of the need and lack of the know-how to create and implement activities. So while at our institution, our scaling up has been intense over these last few years, this shows that we still have some gaps to fill. And you can see faculty comments. They say, no, there are no barriers, I just never thought about it, right? Or not knowing specific activities. Somebody says, it was my first time running a study abroad, so I'm learning to help students engage. And somebody says, no barriers, but I like the idea posted, and we should do more of that, right? So there's some positivity around this as well, and some appreciation for it, but it's something that where support needs to be perhaps increased. So summarizing this, 60% or fewer, depending on how you read the non-responses, of study abroad leaders incorporate intercultural communication directives into their programs. Most of the directives do not include those exemplar characteristics, and when they do, maybe they include one, but not the other one. So that would be a route, too, to further expose how can you continue your efforts by branching out in some of these other ways. And then 2, that the barriers exist for students and for faculty leaders. So in faculty-led short-term programs abroad, we do need greater emphasis on intercultural communication, and we also need greater emphasis on the cultural mentoring. Thinking about cultural mentoring, we can think about it from the theoretical side, right? We can think about contact when students are abroad, cultural content, learning strategies, reflection, intercultural learning throughout the experience cycle, which was something that we touched on, and comprehensive intercultural intervention. On the practical side, we can think about ideas like directing and challenging students to engage, using everyday experiences, making space for formal and informal discussions. So, as said by Anderson, the most effective instructors are those who create a safe place for debriefing. They explore challenges that can act as disorienting dilemmas and become the catalyst for perspective transformation. So, as we think about scaling up our internationalization efforts at our institutions and at all of our institutions, one of the needs that still needs to be fulfilled is how to do cultural mentoring, that's focused on intercultural communication as that main outcome that we're all hoping for, and to continue to support not only the students in their development, but the faculty and the staff that can help encourage student development. Thank you.
Okay, so we do have a lot of time for a Q&A, and I understand that they're going to be running the first portion, so I will give you the microphone, or do you want me to run it to the participants?
Yeah, I think I'm just going to introduce this, and then we'll turn it over to the audience. So in preparing for the symposium, there were some questions that we had that we hoped you all might be able to answer for us. So we wanted to kind of give you a broad context for the things that we've discussed here today. So some of the themes that we felt that we were touching upon was working with faculty, intentional engagement with diverse student populations, developing as educators, so that reflection, reframing, and revision, creating a community of intercultural practice and support across siloed units, incentivizing involvement, whether it's through scholarships or grants or various trainings, the culture of mentorship, so both for students, but also for the mentors themselves, providing training and mentoring people who are mentoring for the first time. And then approaches to fostering intercultural development, those mindsets and specific behaviors that we're trying to target. So our question is, from this, are there other themes that need to be addressed that we didn't cover in our various presentations? Or from these above, are there some of these that you would like to discuss further or go further in depth about? We do kind of feel like if you have specific things about our specific programs that were presented today, we could answer those individually after the discussion section. So, and of course, you're certainly not limited by these, but these are things that we're curious about.
This is just so that the people watching from home can hear what we're talking about.
So thinking about the one, like, are there other themes? There's one that I was kind of thinking of that I'm, at the college I'm at, I direct a summer study abroad program to Spain, but it's not, interestingly, it's not a Spanish language program. It's a gen ed, we do offer a couple of Spanish classes, but it's largely a gen ed program where students can take courses in English or sociology, anthropology, psychology, depending on the faculty that go. And it's not a study abroad program, specifically my institution. It's a University System of Georgia system-wide program. And so I'd really thinking, like, I would like to do more kind of like these kind of intercultural activities, but because we're now absorbed into this USG Uber thing, I'm taking more of that control is taken away from me. And we used to work with a travel consultant on site that could really help with kind of some of these things and facilitate it. Now we have these on-site providers. So where it's almost like it's a commercial thing, you know, and thinking about, well, how, even within that environment, how can I incorporate more of these intercultural experiences in a program that is kind of not totally led by me?
So,
Do you want to hold on to it? Okay, go for it.
So I think one suggestion I have is, and this is something that we often do with, you know, Aletha talked about the Intercultural Pedagogy Grant Workshop Series. One of the things that we often talk to study abroad leaders about who feel this challenge of how can I incorporate intercultural learning into my already robust program when we get there. And I think this applies to your context of how can I provide intercultural kind of practice for my students that I don't have access to do that while they're there because someone else is running the show. I would give the same advice, and that is consider pre-departure opportunities. So we do encourage that a lot, of helping students explore their cultural identity and develop their cultural self-awareness, and looking at finding opportunities to have those discussions before they leave. But there's certainly also, just to promote my partnership with Centio, their Global Competence Certificate is something students could also consider doing while they're abroad in that platform to supplement some of those things.
I'm really curious about the scaling up of intercultural at Purdue, and kind of as you are training more faculty, is it changing the culture on the campus itself? So I'm sort of thinking about that intersection of international and DIE work, so the diversity, inclusion, and equity. So do you have collaborations with the people on your campus who work in that realm? And for instance, your work with the IDI and all that.
I'll take this one, and I also encourage anybody who might have answers that we don't, I mean, it doesn't have to be a conversation between us and you, but all of us. We have had a position in Sylmar that is currently empty of a liaison with our various cultural centers on campus and with the diversity, equity, inclusion offices in the various colleges. Now, it was a lot for one person, and we're rethinking how that might be structured more effectively. But that's one of the areas that we're highly cognizant of, and that we're trying to figure out how to work more. We're very siloed in terms of various colleges. So one college, like there's a minority in engineering program, whereas I know Laura well, I'm not sure what your title is for, but she's the diversity equity person for College of Science, with somebody working with her or under her. So we don't have one structure. So it's very hard for us to know quite how to work. So it's this constant dialogue, conversation, and partnering is what I'd say. It's really on all of us to try to partner to help work at climate issues. And that broader question of whether there's change on campus or not, I would say I haven't been around on campus long enough to know if there's really a shift. I would say that we know that there are small changes. To you all.
Jeff's flyer really speaks a lot to the impact we've had. I think that came from them. Their study abroad fair is now.
Yes.
Their study abroad fair is now the study abroad and intercultural learning fair. So I think that is not that we want to take credit for everything, but I think that's part of that impact, is that we're seeing these units and colleges separate from us taking the initiative in those areas.
I can think of a couple other examples. I'll just talk about the nursing program. We have a nursing program that is by almost entirely white women students with high GPAs coming from specific suburbs of Chicago and Indianapolis, period. And for a number of reasons, a number of nursing faculty over the last couple of years have become interested in diversity, equity, inclusion, and understanding that both in terms of recruiting their students, but in terms of the nurses they're training, who probably will not go on to be practicing nurses, but will go on and get advanced degrees and become the managers, right? So they feel a strong need for their students to develop a different skill set than they're currently developing. And they're in the process between working with Sylmar, a number of their leaders, and then working with our Center for Instructional Excellence, so what would be a teaching and learning center. They are revamping their entire curriculum over the course of several years so that each year focuses on one of Mick Vandenberg's 4 processes. So the first one is self-awareness, the second other awareness, and then managing emotions, and then bridging cultural difference. And that is really what they want to redesign their entire curriculum around. So that kind of shift is huge. But again, it's not just Sylmar, it's coming from multiple places at once, so it's a synergy.
I think one other example is the School of Languages and Cultures, that, you know, we have always had culture, language, communication experts. But we haven't all been invested in this idea of intercultural competence and what that means. And in our department, in the last various years, I think some of our Italian faculty are here, and they have led the way. And I think it's because of Sylmar and the training that's offered. And then they've taken that up and they've brought it to the department, to the school as a whole. And so I think by having as much impact with individuals, like what came out in one of the presentations, some of those individuals will take it up and they will make it their mission. And this semester we had a learning group that Alitha led in the School of Languages and Cultures, and that just represents this type of partnership and engagement that can have continued impact, right? The School of Languages is also, through some of these relationships, we've developed much stronger relationships and grants, educational efforts with the Global Engineering Program, who's highly connected to Sylmar. And so we're seeing these relationships grow, and it would be something worth taking note of and studying to say, how does this sort of effort purposefully and organically take place? So.
Can I just add a couple of things to this? 1 second before I... Okay, thank you. So Annalisa and I were both from the Italian department at Purdue, and we are the product of Sylmar Intervention. So we started whatever they listed here, the Intercultural Pedagogy Grant, because it was mandatory for study abroad leaders. For CLA, then we continued on to an advanced module, and now we're enrolled in one of those programs that you may have seen, Growing Intercultural Leaders, and we're currently at 3rd level. And we really did what Lori explained. We engaged in a thorough redesign of our entire Italian program to include the intercultural perspective. And as you also mentioned, always in collaboration with Sylmar, it sort of starts trickling down into and involving other people from other languages at all levels. The intercultural study group that we had this semester involved faculty, it involved graduate students, and some of them are right here to present on that very topic. So it's really the trainer sort of principle really works. The way they figured it out with incentives and especially with the support is excellent. And then the hub ICL, which is an excellent resource, it all sort of comes together to support the growth. So I don't know if there's like a visible change in the culture, but everywhere I look, there are people from very, very different backgrounds that are interested and invested in it and are actually incorporating it not only to study abroad, but in their actual curricula, because everything can be taught interculturally. And just a little bit of advertisement, if you want to hear more about it, we have a panel tomorrow, a symposium on that, on that very topic, how we did it within the School of Languages and Cultures. Very, very practical advice, just saying.
I have another question. Regarding the study, you had a control group who did not do study abroad and the group who did. And then you were also speaking about short-term study abroad. So do you have a policy that because how many, if all students, is it compulsory for students to participate in study abroad programs, either short or long? And for those who do not participate for any circumstance, are they also being addressed to develop this IC? Is it like in a policy? Not necessarily in the curricula.
So if I understand, the first part of your question is about requirements for study abroad. Do we have those imposed on the students or compulsory for? So that it's kind of on a school by school, unit by unit basis. So for example, the global engineering minor, the GEAR program, they do require their students to have a semester abroad. There are a number of schools that require some study abroad short term, but university-wide we don't have that. And certainly participation in my program that provides the intercultural instruction and mentoring during a semester abroad, if they're in the global engineering minor, they are required by that program while they're abroad to also take my online course. But we do offer it as an option, and we have that scholarship incentive as well to encourage students to do that. But they're certainly, unless they're in global engineering, they're not required to take the course.
What happens with those who are not required so that they can also develop this competence? Because at the end, they're all professionals, they all tracks.
Yeah, right. So what happens with these students who are not participating in intercultural intervention of some kind while studying abroad? So yes, so this is also why we Sylmar offers a number of programs on campus that target students in on-campus workshops, but we're also working with faculty to get it into the classroom, like with Italian in the School of Language, and of course the work being done in the College of Science. We're supporting those initiatives, but we have various programs that we are voluntary, that we try to recruit and get students involved. Yes, it's still voluntary. Can't mandate it, unfortunately. Letha wanted to add to this.
So I pointed out in my presentation that the Faculty Senate had called for intercultural competence to be an embedded learning outcome. And by that, that meant that all undergraduates should leave with, they adapted the AAC&U intercultural value rubric, should leave with at least a certain level. But there's no oversight. as to how that's going to happen in the different colleges. So my position was created in Sylmar, in fact, in order to be faculty-facing to support embedding intercultural learning in the curriculum. And how that happens cannot be a top-down mandate because of the autonomy of the colleges. So what I have to do is look for inroads, build on relationships that are already there. The Growing Intercultural Leaders program that two of the colleagues here in Italian are participating in right now offers financial incentives and additional mentoring support and opportunities for, in a train-the-trainer model, for lack of a better word, for people to gain the skill set and have sort of the recognized support to become leaders in their units. And for example, one of our key leader is a person in ag, animal sciences, and what she's doing with her students is amazing. And she often feels isolated. So one of the things that happens in a program like this is it brings people from different silos together for support and encouragement, and then they feel that they can go back out and work in their own departments and schools and colleges. So it's this constant process. There are some nuts that are hard to crack, and it's my job to keep wearing away at them on campus because there aren't strong faculty leaders at this point, but that's where we are. So the goal is to work on the faculty to get to the students. Long answer.
Anyone else that whose hand I'm not seeing?
I'm going to take advantage of the lull in questions. Some of the things that we discussed going along with what we have up here is we'd like to hear from you about the things you're doing on your campus to provide intercultural learning.
Thank you. I have a suggestion for for this list actually, and then I can talk about what I'm doing on my campus. So these are mostly about the practical part of these intercultural relations among students, right? For example, is there anything related to questioning these intercultural relations among students in terms of conceptual and theoretical aspect, like talking about culture itself as a concept, or talking about culture as a theory, or maybe encouraging students to take these classes, theory classes, cultural theories, or gender and sexuality theories, for example. It could be better to give them a wider perspective and understanding. Because I am teaching Introduction to Political Islam, and I have students in the class. I have students, some of them from Middle East, North Africa, for Easy A, and and the rest of them are American students. And I was this morning. I was thinking to create an activity actually to make them closer and to learn their culture. And this presentation was very useful for me actually. Thank you so much for that, and thank you actually especially to you because because of this use of this qualitative methods, which is kind of lack actually in most sociology or political science and this kind of research. Yeah.
I do have a couple things I hope will answer some of your questions. So one of the things I think that maybe addresses some of the question about how do we talk about these concepts with students. I think a lot of our work that we do with helping students develop cultural self-awareness addresses that, getting students to begin to think about things they've never really considered. What is my cultural identity? What is my culture? How do I define it? What is it? How do others define it? That in turn, that reflection on themselves in turn helps them begin to recognize complexity in these concepts in others, awareness of self and then awareness of others that they lead naturally. Also, specifically, having these conversations, our Different Lenses workshop series specifically targets students, bringing them into conversations about, Aletha, you're better at listing off the various workshops.
We have one that addresses emotional resilience in polarized times. And these workshops were designed by a colleague who actually talked with students and said, like, where are you feeling the tensions on this campus? And then designed a set of workshops to address those. We used Case Study Conundrum as another workshop. Now I'm blanking. Oh, there's one on telling your cultural story. So sometimes students, especially from the US and the Midwest, don't believe they have a culture because they've always understood themselves as a norm. And so just beginning with that self-awareness, as Dan said, is pretty foundational. And then starting to understand that culture isn't bound and the complexities that come, those things come along too. But we're working at it often from a more affective entree for the students rather than just cognitive. And of course the two are tied together, but many times the activities we do are experiential so that then they have the reflection and the cognitive shift first. So yeah, does that help? Yeah.
This is in response to your question about how are things on our campus or what are we doing. I was resonating a little bit with your faculty vote. We had a similar vote at my institution, followed up by some student demonstrations that had happened following Ferguson and some campus activity. We had certain tapestries taken down, a statue of Christopher Columbus was removed. Things like that, and the students had a list of action items, shall we say, that they presented to the administration. And at the same time, the faculty was saying, "We hear you, and actually, you know, intercultural competence is very important to us too." But what I find is that definitions of either diversity and/or intercultural competence, there are a lot of faculty who are hesitant to engage because they think it means X when someone else thinks it means Y. So I was wondering, how did you all come to a mutual accord on what you're doing in the training seminars? Like I saw Deerdorf go by, I saw the IDI, but like how did this happen that there is now a common vocabulary that's shared across the silos?
Who wants to take this one?
You can first.
I can attempt. So I think the most important part, you know, you touch on something that's very common. We have a difference of vocabulary. How do we talk about this? The most important part is that the conversation starts, right? We're fortunate enough to have a dean who very early on saw the value in this and was there at that 2012 Faculty Senate discussion and started fostering relationships with Mick Vandenberg and Mitch Hammer and bringing those trainings onto campus to start to build that framework for having that conversation. So that, and that kind of grew from the top down in this exploring and trying things out to see what was working. And we did have a lot of success with creating a large number of qualified administrators of the IDI to introduce those concepts of intercultural concept and then building from there. And of course the adoption of the AAC and U rubrics as well as a framework. Those two things were primary in getting that shared vocabulary.
And I would say that different disciplines approach this differently. So, and I would say it's always contested, and even contested among us, right? And so one of the things that we work on is our ongoing professional development and education, and we brought a speaker to campus and then we invite a lot of our partners, I think some 40 people were there, for Amir Ahmed, who was talking about how to bring together the sort of social justice focus that comes out of the critical race theories that have motivated much of diversity, equity, inclusion offices on campus, and then the intercultural learning, which sometimes can seem to skirt the actual outcome and assume that just because you have this competence, all is good, and not actually look at the broader power dynamics. So we are constantly, I think, in discussion, and that's part of the richness of it, like any academic place, is that it's a never-ending discussion. But what we're able to do, I think, is for faculty who are very pragmatic, like for this off-campus study abroad programs, who just want to do something, we can offer them a quick and dirty model. And some of them will just buy it. Thank you, I've got it, this is great, this is opening my eyes, done. But others will want to explore further, and some of what health and human sciences is doing by taking more ownership of what happens in training faculty leaders is precisely because they have other models that they want to bring to bear. Good, right? Good, because they're owning it and they'll work towards outcomes.
Is it now an institutional learning objective officially, or but I don't know what that. It's not like explicit. Okay. But it's
So yes, there are very explicit undergraduate outcomes that are often addressed in courses, right? And you have to have X, X, and Y, okay, for all majors across campus. This is what's called an embedded learning outcome, which means departments are supposed to pay attention to it and ensure that it happens, but there's no oversight unless it comes down to accreditation. You might, yeah, Laura will do more here.
Another hat I wear in the College of Science is I'm supposedly the assessment person. So, every 10 years, institutions get reaccredited. And among the things that had to appear in our reaccreditation, which just occurred, I don't think we've gotten the results yet. It was just at the end of October. How are we assessing whether our students reach our embedded learning outcomes? Now, each college, as we've mentioned multiple times here, we're very siloed. And each college is an entity unto itself and in charge of its own curriculum. So each college, for myself it's the College of Science, decides how and where they are going to assess whether those learning outcomes have been reached. There are 3 embedded outcomes. It's not just intercultural learning, it's communication, and what am I forgetting? It's a long day. I said that already once. Anyway, there's a 3rd one. I'll come up with it when I'm not trying to think about it. And in my college, some of them were assessed at the college level because we have requirements of courses that every student has to finish in the junior or senior year, so we were able to assess it there. Others have to be assessed at the departmental level. So then it becomes a question of, where in the department is that department going to decide to assess that? Okay? So that's how it works. That's the only control that the university has over this, that in fact this assessment takes place. Now, what the quality of the assessment is, that's a whole other topic that you don't want me to go into. Yeah.
Okay, anyone else with a question? I have a question then, if that's all right. Because coming from a Spanish department, and we've heard from Italian departments, et cetera, other than a barrier, language being listed as a barrier in your results, I didn't see much teasing apart study abroad in an English country as opposed to a non-English speaking country. And I've been trying to figure out how to phrase this question, but like how to kind of tease apart the intercultural when there's sometimes and sometimes not a language difference as well, if someone could help me out with that.
Interesting that you would pose that question. That's actually my next research topic. I've been gathering data on our semester abroad students of their travel experience. So have they just traveled to other countries at all, vacations or otherwise? Have they participated in other study abroad programs? So what is their level of experience, but also their language experience? And so the question there is, are you a native speaker of the language where you're going? Or have you reached a novice level, an intermediate level, an advanced level? And I use our course levels in the School of Languages and Culture as kind of a measurement for that. And I'm collecting that data and trying to discover, is there a link between that language barrier, do you speak the language of the locals and how well, and your growth in intercultural development. So that's going to be one of the things I'm exploring. I don't have an answer for you yet, but it is something we've been looking at. And certainly our predecessors, that was one of their primary focuses. Page in the Georgetown Consortium project, they looked at that connection as well.
Yeah, that's one of my main interests in my research is kind of trying to figure out how to bridge second language development and intercultural competence. And so I've been using second language as attempting different ways to measure intercultural competence, but via the second language, right? Because if like in this presentation today, my main concern is this outcome of communication, it doesn't matter to me if someone has the right mindset to be, you know, an adaptive intercultural communicator. But what matters to me is that they can actually communicate with people, and for a lot of people, that means using a second language. So I've looked at intercultural knowledge, but through qualitative analysis of L2 talk, right? And because what can they do? What kind of knowledge can they exhibit in the L2? And then more recently, I've been looking at, you know, are there ways to identify in L2 talk how students create stances around cultural difference, and in essence then aligning with these stages of intercultural development. But there are few people who are working on this topic of L2 and intercultural competence. And some of these big theorists, you know, Dr. Fontini, who's here, and I think it's Byram, right, started with this interest of, you know, in language classrooms we must include culture, but it is united in the communication element, right? Using L2 to exhibit intercultural competence. And I'm also really interested in that. And I think embedding it in the curriculum too, if we're using these concepts in language courses, it will become a more and more united field. You know.
Perfect.
So I'd be really interested in following up that conversation. I missed the presentation, so I apologize if this is a little off topic. But to continue commenting on that, we have some surveys that we're just sort of starting, and it's really interesting to look at some of our heritage learners that are traveling to Spain and the intercultural competence sort of development and knowledge that sort of is going on with them. And so I'm really interested in looking at that and many differences. It's very beginning and sort of, but I don't know if anyone's looking at that or if you've, because I think that is another sort of added complexity that we have to think about too, and the identity and lots of other things that sort of gets in there too.
Is someone going to respond to, or? Yeah. No. I feel like we're having a discussion here, so I thought maybe someone wanted to discuss next. All right. Well, we have about 5 minutes, so if there are any additional questions, or we can discuss as we want. Yeah.
So going back to, doing the survey with language experience, you talk about heritage speakers. One of the things I had figured out very early on in setting up the survey and start thinking about what are the students' experience level with the language of the country they're going to, it's complicated because I'm not just dealing with domestic students. We have a lot of international students who've come to Purdue but are now going on study abroad programs, and who are heritage speakers or who are native speakers going to other countries that speak their language. So you're absolutely right. This area is ripe for research and study, and that's one of the exciting things about doing this now.
Yeah, I've seen some work too that they focus specifically on, the types of knowledge that are explored or that are gained in study abroad, and that not only depends on the identity of the students themselves, but it also depends on the social political environment to which they go. And just thinking about Spain study abroad, some of my work, we've compared data from a Madrid program and a Basque Country program, and even that, being in the Basque Country where you're exposed to the idea of ethnicity, in so many different ways, those students gain this social knowledge about ethnicity as a cultural concept, as a social concept that they don't gain in the Madrid location. And so I think that as we're thinking about why should students go to specific areas, it could be about the student's identity, and it can be about the place that they're going, and the learning that happens in those places is different, right? And there's proof of that. So I think as we learn more about how identity and how geopolitical issues, interface, we can even more prepare learners to think about why are you going? What do you want to learn? What do you want your students to learn? And that should shape the activities that people engage with. So, yeah, I'm really interested in your future work.
Okay, anyone else? Still have 3 minutes. Or has it just been a very long day? Okay, closing comment.
So I think we're ready. So just touching on 2 things that were brought up. Love to see your research in the Hubicle one day, and I'd love to see your activity that you're thinking about putting together submitted to the Hub. Please go to hubicl.org and register and collaborate with us and build this community with us. Thank you all for coming.